Perfect. And Diane, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Community Health Sciences O'Brien seminar, How to Make Your Work Open Access Without Breaking the Bank. My name is Diane Lorenzetti. I'm one of the moderators for this session, and I'll be introducing our speaker for the afternoon. First, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Welcome, everyone. We would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Our speaker today, my colleague, Christy Harrell, will be speaking to us on this topic of open access. Christy is the director of Lab Next at the University of Calgary. Her role involves advancing digital research initiatives and partnerships, working on scholarly communication and open education initiatives, and coordinating Lab Next. Lab Next is the library's digital scholarship collaboration space and makerspace. Christy's research and practice interests stem from her interest in new ways of sharing and tracking the impact of research. Christy has an MA in Communications and Culture from Ryerson and York Universities and an MLIS from the University of British Columbia. During the session today, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A, and I and others will be moderating them. Christy will also be pausing us a couple of times during her presentation to address some of these questions. So I hope everyone will enjoy this afternoon's presentation. Christy, take it away.
Thanks, Diane, and hello, everyone. I think I know a few of you by name, so it's nice to see everyone again. And for those of you who I don't know, nice to meet you over Zoom. I'm just going to share my screen here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about open access publication, and the reason why that it's called How to Make Your Work Open Access Without Breaking the Bank is because I'm going to focus on options for making your work open access that don't cost a lot of money. So I have no conflicts of interest to declare on this topic, and this is sort of the schedule of events that I'm hoping to cover. We'll talk a little bit about the history of scholarly publishing and the open access movement. And then we'll go through all the different ways that authors can make their work open access, which I used to call paths, and it's now a little bit more like a labyrinth. So we'll try to step through that labyrinth together and hopefully come out the other side understanding the different ways. And then we'll focus in a little bit more on the ways that you can make your work open access without paying a lot of money, and talk about the supports that we have at the University of Calgary for doing that. But I thought I would start a little bit with some information about me and how I started getting involved with open access. So I was reflecting late last year that I've actually been doing this work for about 15 years. As Diane mentioned, my background is in communications. And when I first finished my MA degree in communications, my first job out of grad school was working at UBC with a large group of epidemiologists and occupational health specialists who were doing work on environmental and occupational health. And in that kind of very applied public health research, there were a lot of stakeholders that were very interested in the work that we were doing. And a lot of the work that we did could not be possible without their participation. Thinking about, occupational health studies and environmental health studies that require community and worker participation. And I started to bump up against the fact that, the peer-reviewed journal publications that came out of that research were not accessible to the people who participated in it a lot of the time. And that was really the first time I started thinking about how strange it was that peer-reviewed work wasn't available to people who could use it, and started getting involved in open access. And it actually inspired me to go back to school and become a librarian. But it's been a long 15 years. And I saw this meme on Twitter the other day, and it really spoke to me. So this is how it started. I thought, the internet is going to be a publishing utopia. We'll be able to get rid of paywalls. And now I think I'm a bit tired, and I realize, like many of you, that the utopia didn't quite, it's not here yet, and I'm not sure if it ever will be, as we face publishers asking for very large sums of money to make your work open access. The dream is still a little bit out of reach, I think, but that's a little bit about where I kind of come to from this work. If my face looks familiar to you, I've worked in most of the hospital libraries in Calgary, as well as a hospital librarian, and that's how I first started working with Diane. And I'm doing scholarly communications work now in sort of a different role, but still really interested in it. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of scholarly publishing. This is sort of a very simplified life cycle of what we all do as scholars and authors in our disciplines. So, you have an idea. Hopefully you can get some grant funding to support that idea and do a bunch of research analysis. We write up our results and we send them off for publication. And sometimes it can be a very long process between sending that manuscript off and having it accepted. So, we celebrate, we get really excited when something is accepted for publication. And then after that happens, typically what we are asked to do is sign our copyright away to a publisher. And that publisher puts our work behind a paywall. And so access to that work is only available to people who pay for it. And typically that money is coming from institutional budgets, so university library budgets, or government budgets, or healthcare organization budgets. And so the people that can access that work are only the ones who are associated with organizations that have large budgets to pay for this access. And I guess the paradox about this model is that in essence, we're paying for scholarly work twice, because we're using primarily tax dollars to fund investigations and research in the first place. And then we're using tax dollars again to buy back access to that same work. So that's kind of the paradox in this life cycle model that open access seeks to interrogate. And it really was the advent of the internet and digital publishing and digital sharing of scholarly information that did kind of set this spark for change. Scholarly publishing has been around since the 1600s. The first peer-reviewed journal appeared in the 1700s. And really, fundamentally, it hasn't changed that much since then. So we are quite slow to change, I think, in academia. And there is lots to like in the current model. For all of its faults, peer review serves us fairly well. And people are very attached to particular disciplines or particular journals in their disciplines. They may be associated with societies, and they can be a really important locus for community and the kind of filtering and dissemination of ideas. So there's that piece of the tradition that we are a little bit resistant to change. And then there's also this big piece that scholarly publishing is really driven by a market model. So there's been some interesting research done actually by a researcher at the University of Montreal, looking at sort of the political economy of publishing. And what this paper published in 2015 shows is that the biggest 5 publishers, so these are the ones you're familiar with, Elsevier, Wiley, they account for more than 50% of all papers in 2013. And that pushed La Riviere and his co-authors to call them an oligopoly, right? So they have a really strong market share. And we're seeing since then even more consolidation in the publishing market. The second thing is that scholarly publishing is a very profitable business. Large commercial publishers have profit margins between 30 and 40%. And they are not willing to let go of that profit model. They exist to enrich their shareholders like any private business. And so forcing changes to their model without them losing that profit margin has been extremely challenging. And then I think the other really important factor at play in the scholarly communication system, which I know I don't need to tell you all about, is that the prestige economy is really important for academics. And what I mean by the prestige economy is knowing that your hiring, tenure, promotion, all that kind of advancement in your field can be extremely dependent upon where your research outputs are published. So I think we all can spend time critiquing that prestige economy and realize that there's a lot of flaws in it, but it is the reality for a lot of people. And here at the University of Calgary, as I'm sure many of you are probably aware, we recently signed on to the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, which attempts to sort of fight back against this prestige economy by saying that research should be judged on its merits, not on where it is published. But we'll see, how that shakes out in actual policy and practice. It's going to be very interesting. So what was the dream for open access? This is the definition of open access that was developed in 2001. So it's been 20 years now that this definition has been around. And the Budapest Open Access Initiative came from a conference of researchers and librarians and other folks involved in scholarly publishing. And they came up with this sort of manifesto about what they thought open access could look like. And their definition is the worldwide electronic distribution of the peer-reviewed literature and completely free and unrestricted access to it by all scientists, scholars, teachers, students, and other curious minds. So I like this definition because it really does focus on the reader, on the end user of research, and it casts a very wide net about who those end users might be. The other important thing about this definition, and I think the sentiments behind it, is that open access means not just free to access and read, but also free to use and reuse. So for authors of research, the important components about open access publishing is that you maintain and retain the copyright for your work, and therefore you are free to use and reuse it any way that you see fit in the future. So some of you may have had the experience in the past where you've published a journal article, for example, with a commercial publisher, and you wanted to reuse portions of that work in another setting, and you had to ask for permission from the publisher to do that. So open access does remove those barriers to use and reuse. It also opens up options for like data mining, text mining of large data sets as well. So now that we've kind of covered the definition of open access and a little bit about the history of where it came from, we'll talk about some reasons why you might be interested to make your work open access. And I guess the first one is the stick, not so much the carrot, is that a lot of funding agencies do require it. So the most well-known policy is the tri-agency policy on open access, which has been in place since 2015. And actually CIHR had a policy even before that. But they all require that peer-reviewed journal publications arising from their research is freely accessible within 12 months of publication. So you may feel that you are required to make your work open access by your funding agency, and many other funders have followed suit with this. You may be interested with knowledge exchange or knowledge translation. So this is where I came to open access from. I knew that there were end users that could possibly use the results of the research I was involved with on the other end, and they couldn't get access to it in these traditional journals. And so we know that many partners in research don't have access to peer-reviewed journal literature as we do. And then there's also the issue of equity. So if we think about research, the research community globally, we're lucky to be in the global north, where institutions are relatively wealthy and can afford access to these large journal packages. Many of our colleagues in less wealthy nations do not have the same level of access. So making your work openly accessible can, broaden the conversation in scholarship. Increased citations is another one. There was quite a bit of controversy over whether open access publication would indeed increase citations to your work. And it's impossible to do a fully controlled study on this, but this is a really large scale study done by Heather Pirawar and colleagues in 2018 that looked at a huge number of articles published in the Web of Science database. So it's a multidisciplinary database, and found that overall, when you compared open access articles to paywalled articles, those open access articles were cited 18% more than the paywalled articles. So I think we're starting to see pretty good evidence emerging that there is a citation advantage for articles that are published open access. On the flip side, why would you not want to make your work open access? It certainly can be expensive. So I think it was someone actually from the O'Brien Institute that sent me this study showing that medical researchers in the United States paid up to $30,000 US in the year 2019, which is a lot of money. It's hard to imagine any but the best funded labs being able to afford this kind of outlay. And when you think about what that money could otherwise be used for to support trainees, for example, it can be hard to allocate funding for article processing charges. I keep rounding this figure up. It used to be that the average article processing charge was around $2,500 US. We are seeing outliers up. I don't know if anyone saw the Nature Neuroscience. It was pretty big on social media a little while ago, but they've got I think it's an $11,000 article processing charge for their journal now, which is pretty mind-boggling. A lot of journals are around the $2,500 US mark, but there's a big range in what journals are charging for those fees. There's also been pushback from the scholarly community saying, why should I be enriching these large for-profit publishing houses when a lot of the labor that goes into scholarly communication is provided, as part of my job, and I'm not remunerated specifically for doing it. So we provide the content for free, we do the peer review for free. Why should we then be paying you for, publishing our work? So you may have been aware that many researchers have been boycotting publishers. Elsevier seems to be the key target, but there's been others as well. And then we get to the other side of the equity question, right? Is, well, maybe open access allows people to read scholarly material for free, but what about publishing scholarly material? If a $3,000 US charge is difficult for somebody in Canada, imagine what it is for somebody in a less well-funded institution. So there's two sides of that equity coin for sure. And then a very easy thing is that sometimes it's extra work to make your work open access. You have to learn about Creative Commons licensing and copyright. You might need to be uploading a version of your paper to an open access repository. It's extra steps. It's annoying. You don't want to do it. So there's lots of reasons that people might be a bit bummed out about open access. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about some of the reasons why, I will talk about the how. As I mentioned at the beginning, I used to talk about paths to open access, and there's so many paths that crisscross that it's getting more and more difficult to explain, but we're going to give it a go. I'm going to kind of talk about two main ways that you can make your work open access. And once we get through that, we'll talk about the free or the no cost to you options. But I will just pause. I'm going to take a sip of water. And if anyone has any questions or has had any questions so far before we go to the next step, I'm happy to answer those now. Okay, not seeing any, we will just forge ahead. So the two main kind of ways to make your work open access is either through a journal or for an individual article. Okay, so we're going to kind of go through those two main paths, which kind of intersect in various ways. So let's give it a go. So the most kind of traditional, this is how we used to do it all the time, path is to simply publish your work in a subscription journal. And if you publish your work in a subscription journal, that work is behind a paywall. It is not accessible to anyone except those who subscribe to that journal, typically through their institution. There are options for making your individual paper open, even if it is published in a subscription journal, and we'll get to those in a second. Oh, and I see your question, Miriam. Yes. So Miriam has asked, how much is the real cost for publishing companies? Why such a big discrepancy between publishers? And that is an excellent question. And I think one of the major criticisms of article processing charges is that they confuse price with cost. So just because we're paying $10,000 doesn't mean that the cost for those services is $10,000. And there has been a lot of pressure from the library community for more transparency around, show us what the costs are and what we're paying for. So, how much are we paying your marketing department? How much are we paying for web hosting? How much are we paying for typesetting and copy editing? So it's not to say that there are no costs associated with publishing. There certainly are. And anyone who's been involved with an editorial board will know that there are real costs involved. But it's hard to imagine that a cost for one article is $11,000 US. So there have been some publishers that have been more transparent about their costs and have sort of like ledgers on their website where you can see like this is where the money goes. But I would say that's quite rare with scholarly publishers, and it's an excellent question to be asking. So really good question. Thank you for that. Okay, so yes, so let's get back to our labyrinth here. So the next option for making your work open access through a journal is to publish in a fully open access journal. And these are actually quite prevalent, especially in the life sciences and in medical sciences. So you all are probably familiar with publishers like Biomed Central, PLOS, and many others, MDPI, Hindawi, where all of their journals are open access journals. So these journals have flipped their business model from one where they make their money based on subscriptions to one where they make their money based on article processing charges. So these journals charge authors, when their paper is accepted, a fee to make that work openly accessible for anyone with an internet connection to read. And as we discussed, those article processing charges vary a lot, and perhaps the price of them may not reflect the actual cost. There are some journals out there that are fully open access that do not charge article processing charges. Sometimes you hear those referred to as diamond or platinum open access journals. I don't think there's as many of them in the health sciences, to be honest. They're more prevalent in social sciences and humanities, but they do exist. And these journals are typically funded by universities or by societies, and often do rely a lot on volunteer labor to make them work. Okay. Open access for an article. So that's the next option. And the first one is to publish in a journal which is referred to as a hybrid journal. So these journals are traditional subscription journals where most articles are published behind a paywall and are only available to people who have a subscription. However, authors can pay a fee or an article processing charge to make their individual paper openly accessible on the publisher's website. So this is where we get into the labyrinth where these two paths kind of cross. So the existence of these hybrid journals, which are very, very common, it can make it a little bit difficult for authors to know, am I publishing in a totally open access journal that relies only on article processing charges to be viable? Or am I publishing in a traditional subscription journal that allows authors to pay an extra fee to make their individual article open access? So it can be a little bit tricky that way. The other option for making your individual article open access is to put a version of it in an open access repository. So here at the University of Calgary, we have Prism, which is our open access institutional repository. There's also medRxiv, PubMed Central. There's some medical open access repositories that exist as well. This is a no fee option. It does require a bit of extra labor because it requires authors to proactively upload a version of their paper to a repository, but it is no cost. And it is a legitimate and well-respected way to share your work. And it does meet publisher requirements around open access. I see a question from Ola. Will DORA principles not push these big publishers out of business? That is a good question as well. Maybe I'll talk about it a little bit more as we move through the slides, but I think they're going to do their darndest that it does not put them out of business. So we shall see. So just to summarize the two models of publishing, open access and subscription. In terms of access, anyone with an internet connection can read an open access journal. For a subscription, you have to have a subscription to read it. The copyright and licensing piece is important. So open access journals typically allow authors to keep their copyright. So they're usually released under a Creative Commons license. So you'll see CC BY or CC BY SA. Subscription access journals almost always require authors to transfer their copyright to either the journal or the publisher. For open access journals, they often charge a fee to publish, and then a subscription access journal will not charge a fee to publish unless the author wants to pay to make their article open. So we do have some discounts and waivers available for you Calgary authors. Some of them are fairly small discounts like 15, 25%. Others, like we have a deal with Sage and with Cambridge University Press, where the library is currently covering 100% of open access publishing costs. So we're starting to kind of experiment with different costing models. So I'll share a link where you can find out all the details about those various agreements at the end of the presentation. Any other questions at this point? Yeah, okay. So we'll focus a little bit more on the no cost options. So there's kind of three options for you. Publish in a fully open access journal that doesn't charge article processing charges, if you can find one. And I'm certainly happy to help people investigate those options if you're interested. The second one is to publish in a journal where the University of Calgary has a full waiver. So there are a few options there and they are growing. And then the third one is to publish in a subscription or a hybrid journal, and self-archive a version of your paper. So this goes back to the previous slide when I talked about open access repositories. And this, I think, is probably the most viable option for a lot of people who want to make their work open access without paying a lot of money. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about that option and how to do it at the University of Calgary. So the thing to know about self-archiving is that you typically can't archive the published version of the paper. So the version that you see that appears on the publisher website with all of their formatting and their logo and their typesetting and their page numbers, they own the copyright to that article. You do not as an author. So what they give you permission to put up is either a preprint or a postprint. And I'm going to focus most on postprints here because that is the version that does fulfill CIHR's mandate on open access. Preprint does not, because it's not the final version after peer review. So we'll just talk about these different versions and what they are. The preprint is the version that you send to the journal prior to peer review. And some of you might be in fields where preprint servers are common and people upload their preprints to servers for, to stake a claim to ideas or to get feedback on papers. And that's great if you want to do that. But it does not meet publisher requirements around open access. The postprint version is the version after peer review and after you as an author have made all of the changes to your manuscript in response to the peer reviewers. So it should be the same in content as the published PDF, but it's going to look a little bit different. It's going to be, the Word document, or if you write it in LaTeX or whatever it is you do, it's going to be that version before the publisher kind of marks it up and formats it for publication. It won't be copy edited. It won't be typeset. The graphs and figures might not be placed in exactly the right spot. So that's the version that we're going to focus on archiving. How do you figure out if you're allowed to do this? So the journal website will tell you, look for a page on the journal website called Author Rights or Open Access. There's also a really helpful website called Sherpa Romeo. Sherpa Romeo website is crowdsourced information about every journal and publisher out there and gives you sort of a succinct version of what you are allowed to do with your postprint and whether you're allowed to self-archive it and under what conditions. The third option is to ask a librarian. So I do this every day and I'm pretty fast and good at doing it because I do it a lot. So if you are overwhelmed and you cannot figure out what it is you're allowed to do and when, just email us and we can certainly help you out. I know that this list of journals may not be relevant to all of you, but it's hard when you're presenting to a large interdisciplinary group of researchers. So I chose kind of general medicine journals, but I just wanted to give you a sense of which journals do allow you to comply with CIHR's open access policy without cost. So you can see that most of these journals listed on the screen, you can comply with CIHR's open access policy without paying a bunch of money. The two exceptions are PLOS Medicine and Biomed Central Medicine, which are fully open access journals that rely on article processing charges for their business model. So they're not getting subscription fees. So there's only one way to publish with them, and that is to pay an article processing charge. But for the rest of them, there are options for you, and all of those options do meet the tri-agency requirements. So if you wanted to take advantage of this self-archiving option using our institutional repository, we'll just talk a little bit briefly about how you do that. So the website is prism.ucalgary.ca. Faculty, staff, and grad students can upload any finalized academic output in Prism. So it's not just post prints of papers. You can put all sorts of things in there. Undergraduate students can also upload items as long as they have sort of the sponsorship of a faculty advisor. If your paper has already been published elsewhere, we have a nice feature where if you enter your PubMed ID or your digital object identifier into our system, it will import a lot of the metadata into the system already, saving you from rekeying all of that information manually. So that's a little bit of a time saver. So I just have a quick little video showing you what that process looks like. So this is a shot of me uploading a version of one of my papers into Prism. This is what Prism looks like. And you can scroll down and enter your DOI of your paper. Hit enter. And you'll see that the system populates a lot of the data for you. So it's a little bit of a time saver. This is what a postprint looks like in Prism. So you can see that there's some bibliographic information here with an abstract. We do link out to the version of record. So someone could access the final published version from this page as well. But if they don't have institutional access to that version, they can see the postprint. We also collect metrics on this system as well. So you can find out how many people have been downloading your paper from our repository. You can also see how the article has been taken up in social media or used on Wikipedia pages, which is a kind of a neat feature. For those of you who are master's or PhD students in the crowd, your thesis will end up on Prism as well and will look very similar to this too. So another nice feature of Prism is that even if your publisher has a restrictive copyright policy where you can't make the work openly accessible right away, you can put your copy in Prism and set an embargo. An embargo is another word for a delay, and some publishers have embargo periods between when the article is published on the publisher's website and when the authors are allowed to make an open access copy available. So you can upload your item and set an embargo for 6 months or 12 months or whatever the publisher requires. During that time, people can request a copy of your document and you can send them a copy in a one-on-one relationship. And that is allowed by almost every publisher. You may have received requests by email like this. You can also manage this process through Prism. So people can discover your work in Prism because it is indexed by Google Scholar, by the library catalog, and many other search engines. They can find your paper, they can request a copy, it will trigger an email to be sent to you and you can approve or deny that request. So it's a little bit easier than trying to find PDFs on your laptop and send it back by email. Other things to know about Prism is we also have a data repository called Prism Dataverse that's available for archiving or sharing your research data publicly, not the level 1 and 2 data only, not the privacy stuff that many of you might be dealing with, but those ones that can be shared publicly can be. And you can also use our repositories for depositing supporting materials for publication. So we are often seeing now that journals are requiring your data to be made available when you submit, or you may have research instruments or supplementary files that you want to make available, and you can use Prism for that as well. So that's it for my presentation. I see a few questions coming in through the question and answer module, which we can get to. I'm happy to share my slides out. I think that was one of the questions. I will share my slides with the organizers of this event so that they can be distributed. And I'm always happy for people to contact me directly if you have questions about this. So I see a bunch of questions here and I will read them and then attempt to answer them. And if people have other questions or comments, I know that this is a topic that is fun to talk about. And when I come and present about it, I usually learn as much from the audience as I am teaching you, I think. So I would love to hear your feedback and thoughts and feelings about this topic as well. Okay, these are really good questions. So I see a question about a particular journal. So I'm going to write it down and I will get back to you individually about that particular journal, because I don't know it off the top of my head. It'll take me like 5 minutes to look up and answer your question, but I'm going to write it down. And then there's another question here about when an article is not yet assigned a DOI, how does one create one? So that's a great question. So articles or works that are deposited into Prism, our institutional repository, are assigned a DOI. But if you are going to publish your article in a journal, you want to use the DOI for the version of record. You don't want to have two digital object identifiers for the same article. A DOI is kind of like a social insurance number for your article. You don't want to have two permanent identifiers for the same thing because it messes up citation tracking and things like that. So I would say I would wait until a digital object identifier has been assigned by the publisher before you upload to Prism. And hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Christy, for a great presentation on open access. I mean, I think you've really sort of given us a well-rounded discussion of some of the benefits and challenges, and then also importantly, the strategies for how we can comply with some of these requirements from funding agencies. We do have some time left, so if anyone does have a question, please feel free to pop it into chat.
See another question. How would a researcher know if an article that they cannot access from the journal has been deposited in a repository? That's also an excellent question. Thank you for that. So there's it really depends. But for example, a lot of people are using Google Scholar now, and I don't know if you've had the experience with Google Scholar where you are searching for something and you see under the results page 3 versions of this paper exist or something like that. And if you push on that little link that says 3 versions of this paper exist, you may see a version published, on Elsevier's website, and you may also see a version published on a repository. So typically, Google Scholar does a pretty good job of consolidating records of articles and knowing that, okay, the version that was published on a repository is actually the same as what was published on the publisher website. So that's one way. And I think, Google Scholar is something that's widely used in the academic community. The other way is that many people, myself included, are using browser editions. So there's one called the Open Access button. There's one called Unpaywall. That's the one I use. So it's an add-in for Chrome and Firefox that as you're kind of surfing around publisher websites, a little green button will appear on the side of my screen. And that indicates to me that an open access version of that paper is available. So any works that are deposited in Prism, our institutional repository, are tracked by this Unpaywall system, and they allow people to access works that way. So that's a really useful tool that I recommend even to those of us who are working within an institution that has good access to papers, because it can sometimes surface material that you would otherwise have to request via interlibrary loan or things like that. Okay, another question, great question about the connection between open access fees and predatory publishers and how to tell who is real. Yeah, excellent question. And I have thoughts about the term predatory publishers for sure. And it is something that can be tricky to navigate, I think, particularly for new researchers or people who are maybe publishing in an area that's slightly different from their usual discipline, or if you're doing multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary work. Predatory publishers are those that charge fees and do not provide the kind of editorial services that we would expect from a legitimate journal, like peer review, editorial services, copy editing, that sort of thing. So they're basically scams. I like the phrase scam journal better than predatory journal because I think it's a more descriptive. How to tell if they are real. So there's a really good website called Think, Check, Submit that has some questions to ask yourself as an author that will really help you kind of suss out whether a journal is legitimate or not. Many of them are quite easy to suss out. You know, if you spend 5 or 10 minutes looking at the journal website, you'll notice typos. You'll notice that the scope of articles being published is quite bizarre, right? It seems like overly broad or strange. You may not recognize any of the people that sit on the editorial board, for example. Another thing is you can reach out to a librarian. We will look at it with a slightly different lens. Sometimes these journals report very bogus metrics that don't actually exist, or they claim to be indexed in Scopus or Web of Science, and they aren't actually indexed in those places, or PubMed. So there's ways that we can help you ascertain whether that journal is legitimate or not. And my final comment on that is please do that assessment before you submit, because these journals are not ethical. Once you submit an article to them, sometimes people realize like, oh, peer review took 2 days and they are going to publish it right away with no changes and they want my money. And they try to retract their articles at that stage. And that is very difficult. And that can be really devastating, especially if you're a grad student and, you know, this is half of your PhD thesis or something like that. So please do your due diligence before you submit, not after, because that's a really tricky situation to be in. Okay, and a question, what language do we look for to ensure that the publisher does not prevent us from sharing our work also on Prism, for instance? Yeah, so great question. So the language that publishers use is not consistent, which is one of the things that makes this a little bit challenging and confusing. So I have become adept at control Fing my way through publisher websites looking for particular words. And the words that I look for are green open access. That means self-archiving or self-archiving. The website that I mentioned earlier, Sherpa Romeo, is another really helpful place to go. They present that information using sort of infographics. So it can be a little bit easier to parse than the dense text that publishers sometimes have on their website. My opinion about this is that publishers don't want to make this no-cost option easily understandable by authors. And so they obfuscate the information a little bit. So look for those words, self-archiving or green open access. And when in doubt, don't hesitate to reach out and just ask. Okay, yeah, the infographic resource is called Sherpa Romeo. Let me just stop sharing and I will paste the URL in the chat. And if there's any other questions, feel free to keep them coming. These are all excellent questions. I just pasted it there. Thanks, Jeannie. Okay, Diane, I think we can let people go. Thank you so much
Okay.
for everyone for attending and for your attention and for your thoughtful questions. It was really great to be able to interact with you even through Zoom.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks especially to Christy for providing this really informative seminar for all of our attendees. So thank you.
Thanks.